would think that you would start talking about forgiveness by giving a definition. Here's what forgiveness is. But that's a very difficult thing to do. And I've read various definitions from various people, and the problem is there are different aspects to forgiveness. If you're going to define forgiveness, you have to talk more specifically about what part of forgiveness you're talking about, and it gets confusing. So what I actually decided is that it's far more helpful to talk about what forgiveness isn't first. Because if you don't do it that way, what happens is when you start talking about what forgiveness is, everybody's thinking, well, yeah, but this, and yeah, but that. And so you feel like you can't move forward because there are all these yeah, buts out there. And so that's really what we're going to try to do today, is address a whole bunch of the yeah, but this about forgiveness first, and then hopefully that'll kind of smooth our way for talking about what forgiveness is. So let me just say this one thing to get us started, though it's very obvious. Forgiveness has to do with genuine wrongs that affect others. And I know genuine wrongs is a little fuzzy, but let's just say from the outset that when we talk about forgiveness and asking for forgiveness and those kind of things, we're not saying that you should go up to somebody and say, you know, you've been kind of grumpy recently, but don't worry, I forgive you. Or, you know, I'm not sure you really like me, but don't worry, I forgive you. We're not talking about things like that, right? We're talking about genuine wrongs, identifiable wrongs by one person that have directly affected another person. And how many of wrongs like that do you think are done every day? In a world of more than 7 billion people, how many wrongs are done? So how relevant is forgiveness? And the other reason why forgiveness is so important is because those wrongs affect relationships. And we live in a world driven by relationships. That's where we live. So that's why forgiveness matters. Okay, let's jump right into our list of what forgiveness does not mean. So I think that should be right there at the beginning of your handout. And I would love to have you ask questions as we go along. If you ask questions in this first portion, it's likely that I'll say, we'll get to that later. But if there's something I say that's just plain confusing, please ask for clarification about that. Okay, let's jump into our list. First of all, forgiveness does not mean that the wrong done to you doesn't matter. Okay, there we hit the number one fear related to forgiveness. If I forgive somebody, then they just get away with it. They're going to think it doesn't matter that they did that to me. And so it's very important for us to emphasize that forgiveness in no way minimizes wrong. Now, it might feel that way to you. When you're the one trying to forgive, it may well feel to you like you're minimizing the wrong. But forgiveness, properly understood, does not minimize wrong. As a matter of fact, I hope we'll be able to see later that the power and beauty of forgiveness come only when you really see the full weight of the wrong. This is part of where we get into trouble. We minimize the wrong and thus minimize the forgiveness. It's like if someone gives a diamond ring. At first glance, many people, I wouldn't be able to tell whether it's a $500 diamond or a $10,000 diamond. Only when you've looked really carefully at the diamond will you know the value of the gift. And in a similar way, forgiveness is most powerful when you really see the ugliness of the wrong that was done. If you minimize the wrongs, you minimize the power of the forgiveness. Secondly, forgiveness does not mean that you must make excuses for the one who did wrong. Forgiveness doesn't mean that from then on you have to explain why it wasn't really a big deal. It doesn't mean that you have to tell other people, it's okay, it doesn't matter. Well, it did matter, right? And forgiveness doesn't change the fact that it mattered. Thirdly, forgiveness does not mean that you have to ignore or minimize the hurt, okay? It doesn't minimize the wrong, and it doesn't minimize the hurt for you. Forgiveness does not mean toughen up. It's not a big deal. Get over it. That's not what forgiveness means. Forgiveness does not mean that you must be passive, essentially ignoring wrongs that are done to you. People hear that Jesus said that if someone strikes you, you should turn the other cheek. And they panic a little bit because they think that means you should passively lay down and let anyone do anything they want to you. And then they think that that's what forgiveness means. That when I forgive, I'm saying to you, you can do anything you want to me. Now, when I say it that way, I think we would all say, no, that's not what we mean. But that is a genuine fear. And it's important for us to say, first of all, that Jesus did not mean lay down and let anybody do anything they want to you. Jesus was calling you to a very high standard of not retaliating. But that is not the same thing as passively letting anyone do anything they want to you. So forgiveness does not mean that you have to be passive and ignoring wrongs done. Forgiveness does also not mean that you cannot be purely angry about sin. We spent several weeks on anger recently at our church, and there is a pure, right kind of anger about sin. There's a right anger that opposes what's wrong with the world. Now, that right anger can quickly turn into wrong anger, sinful anger. But there is a right way to be opposed to oppose wrongs and to want to make them right. Okay? Forgiveness is not the opposite of pure anger. It's the opposite of sinful, destructive anger. But forgiveness actually works together with pure anger. Forgiveness, next, does not mean that it is the only response to wrong. Some people try to misuse forgiveness and say that if you forgive, you won't do anything else about the wrong. As if this is the one response that rules out all of the others. But that is not true at all. Okay, this is vital for us to understand, and a lot of the confusion about what forgiveness means, I think, comes from not understanding that forgiveness works together with other responses. It's not the one response that cancels out any others. It works together with other responses. For example, forgiveness does not mean that you should ignore the possibility of danger to other people. And forgiveness does not mean that you have to hide the wrong from proper authorities. Those issues are unrelated to forgiveness when you understand what forgiveness is. They're unrelated. Okay? When you understand forgiveness, you'll understand that you can forgive someone and still call the police. Right? That's true. True forgiveness takes that into account. So forgiveness does not mean that it's the only response to wrong. It also doesn't mean that you don't care about justice. Now, at the very heart of forgiveness is releasing justice. But it's not releasing justice into thin air. It's releasing justice to the proper authorities. You see the difference? Forgiveness is not saying justice doesn't matter. Forgiveness is saying justice is not mine to carry out. And I'm going to release it to those who have that responsibility. Ultimately God, and then if it's a legal matter, then earthly authorities too. That raises an interesting question. Can a Christian rejoice over a guilty verdict for someone else? Can a Christian rejoice over a guilty verdict for somebody? Well, like a lot of things we'll say today, yes and no, right? No, because a Christian always has a heart for mercy. You always wish people could receive mercy. And yes, because if a surgeon who has been taking advantage of one person after another finally gets stopped and can't do it to anybody else, you are glad, right? So can a Christian rejoice over a guilty verdict? Sure. And sometimes you'll find yourself longing that person could receive mercy. But either way, it's probably not in your hands. Justice is something you release to the proper authorities, unless you happen to be the authority in an unusual situation. All right, how are we doing so far? We didn't exactly wade into the waters, did we? Woo! Splash. All right, we're swimming already. Forgiveness, next, doesn't mean that everyone must ignore the need for change in the person who's done wrong. All right? So suppose a pastor tries to speak to a man who's been harsh with his wife, and he says to the pastor, "But she's already forgiven me." What's he saying? He's saying, if she forgave me, you can't talk to me about this. Now, where did that come from? When did that become part of the definition of forgiveness? We're grateful that she's forgiven you, but you need help to change. So let's talk about this. Forgiveness also, next, does not mean that there are no penalties for what has been done wrong. And you know that already. In the Bible, there are sometimes earthly consequences even for forgiven people. Now, sometimes forgiveness includes mercy, even involving penalties. That even happens in courts, right? Judges sometimes decide to extend a certain amount of mercy, depending on circumstances in a situation. So, forgiveness doesn't have to mean that there will never be any consequences. But mercy is always involved too. Mercy is always on the table for Christians. But forgiveness does not mean no penalties. Forgiveness does not mean that there should be no safeguards put into place. If the new teenage driver in your family drives in the rain at night and gets into an accident, you can forgive her, but you still probably need to set up a safeguard about driving at night and driving in the rain until she can mature more in her driving skills, right? Now, that's not a great example because getting in an accident driving at night in the rain is probably not sin, you know. She probably didn't actually directly wrong you. But sometimes simple examples are helpful, and I think that illustrates how safeguards still matter. So you could say to her, okay, you can't go out and drive tonight because remember what happened last time. You've got to get some more experience. And she could say, I thought you said you forgave me for that. Well, forgiveness doesn't exclude wise safeguards, all right? Forgiveness does not mean that the wrong must be ignored if it happens again. Forgiveness is related to a wrong in the past, not a wrong in the future. And I know that some of this seems really kind of obvious, but then when you get into the weeds of discussion about forgiveness, it gets really fuzzy. And some of these basic principles are the reason why it gets so confusing, because we're missing some of these things. Forgiveness is about a wrong in the past, not a wrong in the future. So to use an overly simplistic illustration, it's not really about sin. Fred comes to work 20 minutes late, and his employer forgives him instead of giving him a written warning. A few weeks later, Fred comes to work 20 minutes late, and his boss gives him a written warning. And he says, I thought you forgave me for that. Okay, well, the forgiveness was for the event in the past, not for the event in the future when you did it again. Back to the teenager driving, she may get ready to go drive again, and Dad might say, remember what happened the last time? And she might say, I thought you said I was forgiven. Okay, but it's night and it's raining again. The next point there, the wrong can never be talked about, goes right together with this. This is a huge misunderstanding. Now, why is it a misunderstanding? Because there is truth to the idea that forgiveness involves a certain commitment to not keep talking about this all the time, and to not keep beating the person over the head with it, and to not keep bringing it up and putting it right in front of them and saying, you remember what you did, right? Okay, so that's true. But don't take that all the way to mean that forgiveness means you can never talk about what happened again. This may be one of the most common misunderstandings about forgiveness. Can the teenage girl say to Dad, Dad, you may never talk to me about driving safety again because you forgave me? Isn't that absurd? Yet you often hear people say that about forgiveness. You can't talk to me about that because you forgave me. No, that's not true. If our relationship's going to grow, if we're going to mature and understand how to work through some of these things, we're going to have to probably talk about these things. Now, that's different from you using it to blackmail or bringing it up all the time, right? So we'll talk about that later. But forgiveness does not mean that the wrong can never be talked about with the offender again. Next, forgiveness does not mean that the person who has been wronged can never tell anyone. There's another very common, very damaging misunderstanding, because If you believe that forgiveness means you can never tell anyone, you just forced someone into a dangerous silence. Now again, there's truth here, right? Forgiveness means that you're not going to gossip. You're not going to run around trying to tear somebody down by telling other people what they've done. You're not going to keep spreading their wrong to others. But a person who has been wronged in a significant way needs help, and they must be allowed to get that help from appropriate people. Now, Chris Bronze has a good little phrase. He says, keep the circle small. Keep the circle small. Tell the people that need to know, the people that have to know. Okay? But forgiveness is not a promise of complete silence. So, a woman has an affair, her husband finds out, he graciously forgives her. Does that mean he can't talk to his pastor? He can't talk to other wise friends to get their help and prayer? No. Keep the circle small, but forgiveness is not a promise that no one will ever be told. All right, we still doing okay? Forgiveness does not mean that trust has been fully restored. Forgiveness and trust are definitely related, but they're not at all the same thing. Forgiveness is not a promise of trust. Now, trust is important, and it's a gift of love, and I do think that forgiveness involves an attempt to trust. But if someone forgives you, it's not fair for you to demand that they fully trust you. If someone forgives you, it's not fair for you to demand that they fully trust you. Forgiveness does not mean that your relationship will be just like it was before. Sometimes a relationship will never be the same again. A teenager abused by an adult will probably never relate to that adult in the exact same way. And you can't expect that. You can't push for that. Forgiveness does not mean that everything just goes back to normal. Forgiveness does not mean that reconciliation will happen. All right? Forgiveness is something that's commanded by God and done by you individually. Reconciliation takes two people. And so when the Bible speaks about forgiveness, it says, you must do this. When the Bible speaks about reconciliation, it says, as much as is possible, as far as it depends on you. You see the difference? So you forgive with the hope of reconciliation, but forgiveness in no way guarantees it, and God understands that. So later we'll talk about how you can pursue reconciliation after offering forgiveness. All right? Forgiveness does not mean that all of your negative or hostile feelings toward the other person will immediately go away. Why? Because forgiveness is not a feeling. You can identify someone who thinks that forgiveness is a feeling because they'll say something like this. They'll say, you know, I think maybe I'm starting to get there. I think I'm starting to feel more like I might be able to forgive that person. That might mean that what they're waiting for is to feel like forgiveness. And that puts you at the mercy of your own emotions. It essentially traps you in bitterness until your own emotions catch up. Meanwhile, your bitterness is making sure your emotions don't catch up. So it's very important to understand that forgiveness is a choice you make in the midst of the hurt, in the midst of the negative feelings. Think of it like this. Forgiveness is like I don't know what illustration to use. It's like a life jacket, or it's like guardrails, or it's something that protects you from doing damage with those negative feelings. Forgiveness protects you from doing hurt and causing harm and making a big mess when you feel hostile toward a person. You understand what I'm saying? You don't wait till you stop feeling hostile to forgive. You forgive when you're feeling hostile as a way of saying, God, help me not retaliate against this person, not return evil for evil. So the reason why this is important, I think, partly is just for the sake of your encouragement. Because it can be very discouraging to feel like I forgave them and I'm still really mad at them. What's wrong with me? Well, obviously you want God to work on those feelings of hostility, but that doesn't mean you didn't forgive. Okay? Feeling really hostile at somebody is a matter of feelings. Forgiveness is a matter of a choice you make. Forgiveness does not mean that you'll never think about that wrong again. All right, forgive and forget is a very common phrase. And it actually comes from something in the Bible, because the Bible says that when God forgives us, he does not remember our sins anymore. But that doesn't mean remember in terms of your memory. That remember is a Hebrew idiom for God keeping his promises and acting on his covenants. So it's not talking about God's memory. It's saying that he's not going to look at our sin and hold it against us anymore. But some people have misunderstood that to mean that, well, God forgets our sin, so you should forget my sin too. And that's not at all what it means. Forgiveness is something that you can choose. Forgetting is not. Now, if you live in bitterness, if you choose to dwell on those things because it makes you feel better to nurse your grievances, you're going to sear those memories into your heart. You're going to make sure you never forget them. So in that sense, we can play a role in our forgetting, because we can't make ourselves forget, but you can make yourself remember. That's what I'm saying. Okay? So we don't want to do that. We don't want to make ourselves remember by choosing to nurse this grudge. But you can't expect to just forget what has been forgiven, and the Bible doesn't tell you to do that. Hey, did we just make it to the end of our list? I turned the page and we were at the end. All right, how do we do? That was a lot at once. But now that you got that big list, when we start to talk through what forgiveness is, and your mind starts to say, well, yeah, but probably it's on that list already. Probably we already touched on it, and it'll start to really connect, and you'll say, oh, yeah, that's right. Forgiveness is not that. And that list itself gives you a tool both to help yourself and help other people, because you'll hear other people wrestling with forgiveness. And as you listen to what they're saying, you'll realize, they're misunderstanding this. And you can help them when you know those things.